My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Does it feel like your whole world has just been turned upside down? Are you having trouble remembering to drink water or eat? Does it feel like you're walking in quicksand? You can't even concentrate on normal things? You may be walking through trauma. There may be a crisis in your life or in your government that is causing you to feel that you don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. I have walked through times like this, and it really has helped me to walk with a professional therapist through these times. I highly encourage you to find a therapist, and at betterhelp.com/difference, you can get 10% off your first month today. I myself have benefited from a therapist I've worked with there. You can message your therapist in between sessions, go to extra courses around grief or trauma, find support groups, and also really have a person to help you walk through some of the most difficult parts of your life right now. You can get 10% off your first month today by going to www.betterhelp.com/difference. You deserve to heal. Welcome back, difference makers. Today we're revisiting one of your all-time favorites, our second most downloaded episode of 2024. In this transformative conversation, we're joined by Dr. Chuck DeGroat for his second appearance on the podcast. Many of you will remember his incredible insights from our earlier discussion about his book, When Narcissism Comes to Church. That conversation left a lasting impact on me personally as we explored how different Enneagram types uniquely express narcissism and really the heartbreaking prevalence of childhood trauma and narcissism among pastors. That book stays with me to this day, even though I read it several years ago, and I know many of you, it resonated with you as well. But this time, Dr. Chuck DeGroat, he really dives into the themes of his latest book, Healing What's Within. Many of you have already read it. In fact, a lot of you have. It's selling very well. A lot of people are really expressing how this book has given them insights, me included. It really sparked some profound conversations. In fact, my own book club, which meets in my home on Tuesday nights, my husband and I have a book club with several friends, and we've been reading it together, and our discussions have been deeply introspective and healing. Healing What's Within is just a very accurate title. It's providing new levels of understanding about ourselves and one another. And I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of Healing What's Within that Chuck was very kindly sent to me. I read it on a flight from San Francisco to Shanghai last year. And as somebody familiar with attachment theories and trauma responses, both through my own personal therapy and experiences like spiritual abuse survivor cohorts I've been in and a retreat I went to in Puerto Rico a few years ago, I was familiar with many of the topics around attachment theories and trauma responses, but I was struck by the fresh insights Dr. DeGroat put into these topics. There were some new words that I call F words because it's trauma responses that all tend to start with the letter F, like fawn and freeze and fold. And he added some new elements into it around attachment responses and just the insights of even if just that chapter of the book is gold. Can't stop thinking about it since I read it on the plane to Shanghai. And we've been going through it. I'm reading it another time with this book club I'm in. And it's really causing me to think a lot and look inside and look at my own history and family of origin stuff and, religion I was raised in and just societies and cultures and the ways that we're formed, right? And so this book, if you have not gotten a copy of it, go out and buy one today. Find it online, find it in your local bookstore, and also listen to this episode as we re-release it because this episode really clearly resonated with many of you, and I can't wait for you to hear it again or for the first time. So let's dive back into this powerful conversation with the remarkable, just outstanding, the researcher, the writer, the just all-around kind and caring human being, Dr. Chuck DeGroat, and continue the journey of healing and transformation together. Hi, Chuck, and welcome back to the podcast.
It's so good to be here, Lori.
It is so good. We're all smiles because we're just so happy to be talking about your new book, which congratulations. It's such a good one. Here it is. Healing What's Within and coming home to yourself and to God when you're wounded, weary, and wandering. And for many who know you through your previous book, When
Yeah.
Narcissism Comes to Church, which you were on the podcast talking about last
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And this one, you're kind of taking, like, it's not a totally different approach, but it's like a different level.
Yeah.
You're talking about a deep look within, which is sort of the opposite of how narcissists kind of approach life. So tell us, how can this book help those with maybe narcissistic tendencies, or all of us, to really walk through trauma and suffering?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like even after the narcissism book, there were people who came around and said, let's do a part 2 version of that, and I didn't have a sense that that was the book, and I think part of this comes out of my own clinical practice. I do therapeutic work, right? And I work with people who want justice for the things that have happened to them, but oftentimes find themselves without justice, right? And so there's that sense of like, and people who get some sense of justice or what they think might be some closure and still feel unresolved internally. And so the question becomes like, so what is it? How do I heal, right? And so I wanted to shift to trauma. We talk about trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens within. And so that's the focus of this book, is like, how do we look within and begin to do some of that healing work ourselves?
Yeah, it's so, I will say, I was reading it on the plane to China recently, and it's not comfortable always. And
Yeah,
often I had to put it down a few times because it's like there's some pretty deep, heavy parts of that
yeah,
that are painful, that are relate to trauma, right? And so, and that's where I think that your previous book really helped help us understand, when you avoid that it could go to really places where you're hurting other
it
people.
could become
Um,
narcissism, right? Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
So, but I will just say, because I'm here in the Bay Area, and a lot of you have a lot of San Francisco Bay Area stories in the book,
yeah,
including where I went to seminary up in the North Bay, Mount Tam. My husband and I used to love hiking up there.
yeah.
But then you also have a story about the South Bay, where I live now with some twins, and I'm a twin mom. So there's a lot of connection points in your book of driving across the Golden Gate Bridge and the fog, and you use a lot of metaphors to help us
Mm,
understand. I want to ask you this question, though. When you look back on your work years ago
yeah,
until now, kind of what has changed in your approach in ministry based on your research and your firsthand experience?
yeah. A lot has changed. I was trained as a therapist. I did a dual, like, Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Counseling back in the mid '90s. And when I was first a pastor in ministry, I was in a more complementarian context. Now, for your listeners, that means I was in a Christian sort of space where women were not allowed to do anything. And my own opinions about that were changing. That probably sounds very regressive to listeners, right? And it is. 25 years ago, I was a 27-year-old going into ministry, trying to figure some of these things out. But almost immediately, I was the one sitting with women who were telling me abuse stories. And I would never, Lori, I would never have guessed that's what would have happened. I sort of expected as a young pastor that I'd be working with men, and that was just kind of the way it went. But I became a safe person for women who were saying, and the wives of leaders within the church who were telling me stories of what they were experiencing, and that led to, as it does in these contexts, disorientation, disruption, and I was eventually fired from that particular church. But I think my approach back then too, I was really angry. I'll just put it that way. I was really angry, and my approach, now I'm talking, I guess, therapeutically, my approach was pretty confrontational. I think that over the last 15 years or so, as I better understood trauma and as I better understood fragmentation, the parts of us that are adaptive and compensatory and play particular roles, I've begun to understand, or begun, or whatever it is, that narcissism, for instance, just to get back to some of the old writing that I did, is not core to a person, but is compensatory. It's a way of coping out of trauma. And most of the narcissists that I've worked with are deeply wounded human beings. I mean, when I do the work, I mean, they were traumatized themselves. They were abused, they were bullied. And not that they woke up one day and said, I'm going to become the bully, but somewhere, somehow, they learned to become the bully, and now they're acting out as a bully. And so my understanding of trauma has helped me become a more compassionate therapist, because I end up working with pastors, sometimes large church, even mega church pastors, who come into this office and sit on this couch over here. And the way in, I've learned, is not through the front door with a battering ram, but through some compassion and empathy that leads them to know that I'm for them. I want the best, but there has to be a both end, right? On the one hand, they've got to deal with their own trauma, and on the other hand, they've got to deal with the harm that they've caused. And the only way that I've found, I'm hoping I'm hitting your question, but I think
Yeah.
the only way that I've found for them to deal with the harm that they've caused, if it's not coerced, because that's what led them to the narcissistic bullying in the first place. So if they find me as one who's empathetic and an ally, I can't tell you how many men I've worked with who are like, they've gotten to a place where it's like, I'm so ashamed, and I want to reckon for what I've done. I want to be held accountable. And then, of course, there's a whole process and path as you go down that road. I've been doing this work for 25 years now, and for as much progress as we've made, you and I were talking a little bit beforehand, I am still utterly frustrated by how many narcissistic abusers get away with their abuse, and how prevalent this is in Christian spaces, in churches, in political spaces. Even as we have an election coming up, I mean, I find myself every day wrestling with, like, not a little despair that this is continuing to go on in so many different spaces.
Yeah, I share your frustration and concern, and I'm so grateful people like you are working in this area. It's really hard. I can't imagine how
Yeah.
hard. And all of us, one of the things we've talked about this in the previous podcast that we recorded together, and people listening to this know that I walked through a workplace bullying situation in a church by a pastor here in Silicon Valley years ago. And so one of the things that would often be thrown around by this bully and his henchmen, who kind of mobbed me together and have done that to others, was they would sort of minimize everything by saying, we're all wounded, we're all just rubbing up against our wounds with
Yeah.
each other, and very much dismiss
Yeah.
without doing the work. Is that something you
Yeah.
hear quite a bit?
It's something I'm hearing more and more. You know that I found out that I thought I coined a term, Lori, but I found out that others were using the language of vulnerability, FAUX, vulnerability.
No way. I thought that was you. Oh, wow.
I thought it was me too, and it turns out that others. I mean, it's in some ways it makes sense, right? Vulnerability, but whatever the origin might be, this idea that back 25 years ago, pastors were not as apt to talk about their own inner life. They weren't as apt to talk about their struggles or their therapy or their wounds or their Enneagram type or any of these kinds of things. But I go into these spaces now, and I don't do as many investigations or inquiries as I used to do. I just don't have time to do that kind of stuff. But I go in, and I'd get the pastor who says, well, I know my Enneagram type. And, I go to therapy, and I can't tell you how many pastors, and there are some like larger profile pastors that people would know that I've worked with, who are into therapy, and they're into the Enneagram, and they're into emotionally healthy spirituality, Pete Scazzero's work, and all the
Right. Great
things,
book.
all the things. And it's not leading to a deeper self-revelation, or at least it's not leading to them understanding their impact on others. Right. And so it's fine. And they use it to gaslight others. Frankly, they use it as a like immunity. Like I get a pass because, I mean, I had a pastor fly up to Michigan and take a selfie with me, sat down with me, and I didn't know that there were things going on in his church, but it turned out he wanted to come up and take a picture with the book and go back with his immunity card to say, well, I talked to the guy who does the narcissism work, and I know my stuff, and I get off free. So it's stunning to me. I mean, I'm sure you see
Classic.
this too, how people are doing this, right?
Oh, yeah. One of the ways that played out with the church I was at, where I walked through a lot of bullying and many things, was they would bring in these consultants who no consultant can know everything. And when you're really good at hiding stuff, literally we would be told to clean out the closets. when like the board, external board came into town from all over wherever they were from. And I never got to meet with them personally, even. I was like an associate pastor. And so it was clear that we were putting on a show, that it was smoke and mirrors. And so when a consultant comes in to, like, right after I was fired, on women and how to treat women, well, they just say, we're so good with women. Women love us. Look at these token women. They love us.
Yeah.
And so I feel like people like you get used by
Yeah.
these people who are hiding something.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm curious about your experience, because I'm seeing this happen more and more in egalitarian spaces, which is to say, in, again, for your listeners, spaces where women are allowed to be pastors, and where it's like, but look, we've got women pastors. We're egalitarian. We allow for this, but it's, it hides the misogyny. Like, I mean, there's a deeper misogyny going on within the system, and yet they're able to sort of say, but we've got women pastors and we allow them to preach. And did you experience something like that, or?
100%. I wasn't even allowed to preach.
Okay.
Then later, Andy accused me of wanting to steal his pulpit. And like, I didn't honestly even want to preach, because he so tone policed me and others that I would have never made it through a whole sermon saying everything exactly like he wanted. We had to be his mouthpiece, even in our welcome and next steps. It was a lot of pressure to kind of take our emotions and our personality out and put his in. Because I think that's all that a narcissistic personality or somebody struggling with that knows how to do, is make clones of themselves. So we couldn't be ourselves. But it was definitely a show. And, he's fought the whole Southern Baptist Convention on behalf of women pastors, while, very badly psychologically abusing me and others. And at the same time, I think about, like, where your book is talking about, and I knew there was trauma there, but he wouldn't really talk about it. So I had a lot of compassion, and that kept me there for a while, just giving him a lot of pity. I think I pitied him a lot. I have a lot of, and so that made me excuse all of his things. And I think in systems, even that are egalitarian, or people who may be deconstructing from evangelicalism and are fresh out of it, some of those people I've encountered in that space still carry a lot of the old with them as they're stepping into the new. And I think that's where there's a lot of areas where the refusal to listen, to understand women. There was never even an opportunity to have a conversation about what my experience was like being the second woman pastor in this church. And the first woman pastor didn't have the opportunity either. There was a whole posture. And I see this also with white supremacy a lot. So there's a lot of connections between the white, the white patriarchy, basically, where you need to express extreme gratitude on a regular basis because they, with the power, allowed you to have these crumbs. And so you're getting mansplained a lot, you're getting man-interrupted a lot, you're getting gaslit, and not, your gifts aren't being seen for who you are. You're tokenized. And so I think a lot of women listening to this that have been in egalitarian spaces that I have spoken with have had those experiences where men are like, you should be grateful I let you do this. It's like, no, God put me here. You didn't do anything. And that's where we see the narcissism coming in. Like, I gave this to you, be grateful.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, and it feels like I'm hearing more and more of those stories, and it's getting harder to tease out. Also, in my work, my therapeutic work, in part because I have so many pastors who would claim that they're doing this kind of work, and I've had consultants come in, and I did a 360 review, and I don't get why I'm being persecuted. I'm sure you've heard things like that.
The Darvo.
But there's also, and this worries me about my profession, the therapeutic world. There are a lot of pastors who have found therapists who, in their narcissistic way, they can find a therapist who is their mirror as well. They can find a therapist who's like, I think you're great. You're so self-aware. It's not hard to find a therapist like that. And so I don't really trust or buy when someone says to me, I'm seeing a therapist. I know my Enneagram type. I've done this consultation at my church. And that's, I mean, again, I know you're seeing this in spades. That's making the work tougher nowadays to really tease out what's going on.
Yeah. I certainly don't understand how we can overcome that easily, but I'm so grateful for you and the hard work that you're doing, because I think it's going to take a lot of brains around this. And I'm really glad that you're trying to push to the next level and get past these obstacles. I know that one thing I've learned in my experience, and we mentioned before when we were talking earlier, I was in this Caneo cohort based in Puerto Rico by Dan and Dan White Jr. and Tanya White, and which included some of your articles. Thank you. But I learned a lot with my cohort leader, Sid Hoxglaw, about nervous systems, and it helped
Yeah.
me understand why I was having trouble walking into evangelical spaces. So
Yeah.
you talk about that a bit in your book, nervous
Yeah.
systems, and how they respond to, environments with this window of tolerance to hyperarousal to
Yeah.
hypoarousal. You call
Yeah.
that home, sympathetic storm, and dorsal fog. Explain
Yeah.
how that works.
Yeah, this feels really important, and it gets at what we were just talking about too, because I'm saying more and more that I am working with a lot of pastors who would claim to be self-aware, but they're not self-regulated. And there's a big difference. That's to say that they're claiming that they're self-aware because they know their Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram, they're going to their therapist and stuff like that, but they're not self-regulated, which is to say that they're not living from a grounded place. They're not living from a centered, grounded, sort of true self kind of place. They're living in what I call sympathetic storm or sympathetic hyperarousal. Now we're talking about our nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system. And that's where oftentimes you'll hear people talk about the responses of fight or flight, add two other F's, fawn and find. But a lot of these pastors are living in sympathetic fight. Um, and it's tricky because that looks like, I mean, just imagine the church planner or the mega church pastor with a lot of energy and the person who's able to say, but there's so much fruit emerging from the work that we're doing. Like I'm engaged in all these things. I've just written this book. We've got a new curriculum. We've got this discipleship program. And I'm even talking fast, trying to mirror what I see in these
Yeah.
pastors. Because they'll come to me and they'll say, I've got my therapist, I got this thing, but God is doing these great things. And after I do these 5-day, 3-hour a day intensives, right? And, at the end of the first day, I'll say, I'm exhausted. I don't know about you, but it feels like you're on this hamster wheel and you're going 1,000 miles an hour. And what we're talking about there is dysregulation. We're talking about a sympathetic storm. And one of the reasons I know about this is because after my own experience of being fired and some of the trauma that was in my own body, I was doing some therapeutic work, but I didn't know how dysregulated I was. I wasn't yet sort of engaged in the larger trauma conversation. So I was so disconnected from my own body. And I ended up landing in a hospital in Mexico when we were on vacation. We'd flown down from San Francisco to Cabo. And that's when I learned, a doctor essentially said, you have the body of a 60-year-old at this point. Your system is septic. And I began to understand the body keeps the score. And Chuck, you were living out of my trauma, I was living in sympathetic storm. And when I moved to the Bay Area, it was like, I'm going to prove that I'm good enough, smart enough. I'm able to do all the things that I'm asked. Like I was going to make that the good experience to sort of reverse what I had experienced before. So I know it in my own body, Lori, what it looks like to live in this sympathetic storm.
Yeah, it seems miserable. And that
Yeah,
dysregulated pastor on a staff can really cause so much
so much.
damage.
Yeah,
And so I know that, you walk through John Bowlby's attachment theory and the halls for attachment styles.
yeah,
And so wondering how, if we're considering this, theoretical pastor who has
yeah,
MBD, for example, and how
yeah,
they're learning to not inflict their wounds on their staff, but to
yeah,
really cultivate a psychological safety and attune
yeah,
to people instead. Like, how could that be
yeah.
different?
Yeah, I mean, it begins with where we just were with understanding nervous system state. So it begins with an acknowledgement that I'm living dysregulated. And as my experience, and I mean, I'm literally sitting in the office where I do this work, is, by day 2 or 3, when we're doing some of this intensive work, if a pastor leans in, and they don't always lean in, as you know, they might be out of here by day 2, But if they start to lean in and understand the dysregulation and get curious about it, there's always a story behind that. Like the question becomes, because it's like, I don't want to live like this. I didn't know I was on this hamster wheel. I didn't know that in my storm, other people were catching the winds and being hit by the debris. I didn't really know that. Then if they're able to continue with that curiosity, they can begin to look at their attachment story, which is to say, where did this start? We were, of course, as you know, because you've done a lot of this work, we're born in and for connection. But when we don't experience connection, when we don't experience safety, when we're not seen and soothed and secure, we will become more anxiously attached or avoidantly attached or attached in a disorganized way. And most of the pastors that I see in this space of dysregulation where they're insecurely attached, which is to say there's a story of of living in these stormy waters for a long, long time. And that's where that's where hope grows in me, because if they start to get curious about that, there are a few things. Will they acknowledge their dysregulation? Will they start to get curious about the larger story? I think where, as you know very, very well, where this is all proven is, will they get serious about the impact on others? Like
Yeah.
it's fine if behind closed doors they're having a conversation with me. It's another thing, I'm thinking of your situation where someone acknowledges this is the harm that we've done, and they take measures to step away, because I think both you and I know a lot of this can't be worked out if you continue in your role. You really do have to at some point step away and begin to do the work. So a lot of what I'm doing is I'm trying to get these pastors to willingly step away before they're forced to step away. A lot of them aren't forced to step away, but will you invest in the work, or is this just for lip service? And I can't tell you how many pastors have said, well, I went to Chuck DeGroat for an intensive. So now they're saying, I know that I used to struggle with self-awareness and self-regulate. So there's always that piece too.
Yeah, it's so tough because this whole thing that develops from this lack of attachment or whatever, insecure attachment,
Yeah.
causes so many of them to want to use people as tools and to not,
Uh-huh.
to not look at themselves and to cast shame on others, but not process the shame themselves. And so when we look at a situation where, how could pastors who maybe didn't have secure attachments and therefore are struggling with this kind of
Yeah.
connection, and you mentioned in the book like the differentiation from others, and
Mhm.
also knowing how to move in and out of relationships with healthy boundaries, these are
Yeah.
areas of struggle. How could they do a better job of regulation with their staff and showing up as a non-anxious presence? This is
Yeah.
something I would hear often from the pastor who abused me and others. He would say
Yeah.
the right things, like be a non-anxious presence, but he wasn't
Yeah.
that. So how could
Yeah.
they change, and what would change if they didn't rule with power by fear and causing anxiety and were
Yeah.
curious about themselves and others?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that there are like everyday ordinary a lot of really good pastors out there. I mean, I know pastors like this, right? Who
Yeah.
are not narcissistic abusers, and but they are kind of anxious and dysregulated in their own way. And maybe it doesn't look like narcissistic bullying, but maybe it looks like a little bit of workaholism or drinking too much in the evening, or whatever it translates to, right? The journey to becoming a more non-anxious presence is one that takes particular kinds of practices and relationships in your life of honesty, where you can experience the kind of co-regulation and attuning in honest relationships that I think that we all need. Those honest, safe, transparent kinds of places. Like there are practices that you can engage in. I think what's tougher in the situations that you've seen and I've seen is that there often needs to be some sort of accountability for the harm that was done, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be accountability for a pastor who drinks too much or who's a workaholic. We need to look at the impact on their family and their church, and of course, but I think that when there's harm over the course of time, and those of us who work in systems, begin to, when we begin to, as I often say, go beneath the waterline, and we're no longer just talking about the one-off event, like that pastor did that one bad thing that time, but we begin to see patterns. We begin to see the systems and structures that undergird those patterns, and the particular mental models that are, and we realize this isn't just a person, this is systemic. Our work is really cut out for us, because it's no longer about, why don't you buy that book and do those practices and become a non-anxious presence? It's like the whole entire system needs to be dismantled, right? Because you've seen these things, I've seen these things. You get one pastor out of a system, but the system is still the system. And so this is where sometimes I do this. My clients know I do this a lot. I put my hand on my chest for my own sense of regulation, because the work is just so vast. Like there's just so much work to do. And it really takes integrity. Have worked with some churches where they're like, okay, we want to do it, whatever it takes, whether it's, getting the pastor out of here, but we want to do the deeper systemic work. We want to go below the surface And we want to look at our history. We want to look at our patterns. We want to look at our polity and our structures. We want to better understand the mental models that we've been working with. Like, we're egalitarian up here, but our mental model is misogyny,
Yeah.
and we want to root it all out. As you know, that's the really heavy lifting. And to do that work, we need many more people who get these kinds of things and are doing this work out there, actively doing the work.
Yes, yes. Amen to that. It's going to take so many of us, and it's going to be important going into the future
Yeah.
because there's a lot of rubble right now, and there's a rebuilding that needs to take place at some level, and we don't want to it's like, I have tsunami relief in my background, so I have visuals of rubble. But when we rebuilt, we didn't rebuild the houses the same way. We retrofitted them for an inevitable another earthquake that would come, because this is
Mm,
a zone where this happens. It will happen again. And so it would not make sense to rebuild houses in the old way. We have to rebuild in the
yeah.
new way. And it took a lot of us, took a huge team of a lot of people and a lot of hours. And it was, but now, we've left something behind that's better and positioned for the inevitable storm. I think
Yeah.
one of the things that you talk about, and as other experts on this in books that I've read, there is just like something that goes on within somebody who's dealing with narcissism, where when shame enters, it's unable, or they don't have the skills to process it. And therefore, those they target seem to be the ones they put the shame onto.
Yeah.
How does that show up, and what should we be aware of with that?
Yeah. I have a friend named Kat Wilkins. She's a colleague in the work, and she's a voice that deserves more exposure. She just did some writing, and in fact, I hosted some of it on my own website and blog, just to get her beautiful and brilliant work out there, because she's trying to tease out some of these dynamics of shame, right? Because I think when we're dealing with bullies like this, when we're dealing with narcissistic abusers, a lot of the grandiosity in the bullying comes out of a story of shame that they've compartmentalized, they've repressed, right? It's like they've pushed that off into the shadows, not necessarily consciously, right? But that's just a part of the story. And what Kat argues very, very wisely and persuasively is they end up displacing that, you're putting that shame on others, projecting that shame on others, which creates further harm and toxicity, right? They're always looking for scapegoats. They're always looking for someone to put their shame on. And so there are people who are dealing with immense shame, who, as a way of coping, shame others. And if you've ever been the victim of that kind of harm, you know what that feels like through their manipulation, their gaslighting. I mean, I look at where I was in 2003. I was a shell of a person. Like, I would walk into a grocery store and have a panic attack that I'd see one of the leaders of the church that I served. And I was very convinced, and I had evidence of it too, that there was sort of a campaign to make sure that Chuck was not going to be able to get a job anywhere else ever again, and you've experienced some of that too.
Yep.
And the word begins to get out in various ways, and I get calls from people, and so I was shamed, right? Like, cast off, and that's essentially what this does. The person who has cast off his own shame, within, is now casting others off in shame. And so, do a search for Kat Wilkins, my brilliant colleague and friend, an up-and-coming therapist and someone who does great work in this area, to read a little bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah, I follow her. She's excellent. Maybe we'll
Isn't she
ask her to
great?
come onto the show and
Yeah.
unpack that. Thanks. And definitely everybody follow her. She's writing some really great stuff. I think there's another part of your book that I found, you kind of reframe something for me. And I love that there are so many parts of your book like that. You quote that famous verse, Proverbs 4:23, that tells us to guard our hearts. It's the wellspring of life,
Hmm.
or everything flows from it,
Yeah.
depending on the translation. And then you kind of talk about these psychological cartographers of the self. And how
Hmm.
do they give us new insight into that verse? Could it mean more than what the sermons have told us?
Yeah. I grew up in a tradition that where I was told that the core of me was bad, and lived with that for a long time, and talk about shame and guilt and all the other things, and was introduced to the contemplative tradition years ago. One of the reasons I love the contemplative tradition is that there are many, many women within the tradition.
Yes.
sort of flew beneath the radar, right? They oftentimes weren't like sanctioned leaders within the church, but they were powerful voices. I often say my favorite 16th century reformer was Saint Teresa of Avila. And she's one of them, a cartographer of the soul who wrote The Interior Castle. Saint Teresa, who didn't occupy some sort of like position as bishop or something like that, but was recognized as an authority because of her wisdom, her depth. And I think that what I've learned about that is that at the core there's dignity, there's worth, and that informs my work. It even informs my work with narcissists because as I'm doing the work, I see them as more than sum total of their behavior or this part of them that they're living out of. There's another contemplative, a woman named Etty Hillesum, who died. She died in Auschwitz in her late 20s, but she was a contemplative in her late 20s, and she's so fascinating. But she saw even in the guards and her captors the image of God in them, which is astounding to me. Like I can't imagine that, right? And so that informs my work in pretty deep and profound ways.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, and in so many ways, it was kind of framed for me in a lot of the evangelical space I was in as an adult, I would say, that it was like a purity culture verse. It was a verse used for men to not lust after women and therefore, you know,
Oh, the
go,
guard your hearts first for the
yes. And
okay.
there's so
I
much
see where
more
you're
to
going with it.
it.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah,
see where
there's
you're going with
so
that.
much more there. And
Yeah,
it's like, wow, you really missed a huge thing by just, I don't know, cheapening it in that way, that it's so
yeah,
much deep. I mean, it's basically the core of your book. Like you've written a whole
yeah.
book, basically, right?
Yeah, about the goodness of the heart, right? But there's so much
Yeah.
suspicion, right? I think in those spaces. That's why I love the Lady Julian of Norwich's and the Hildegard of Bingen's and the Teresa of Avila's, and because I think particularly the women cartographers of the souls, I've called them, they ennoble the body. And I think men, and particularly in these evangelical spaces, are taught from a very early age to be afraid of their own bodies, women's bodies,
Yeah.
and so they live in fear and shame. So yeah, obviously that's a big part of what I'm writing about too. How do we rediscover the goodness of our own hearts and desires as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is this part where, I mean, you actually end up there's the freeze, fawn, fly. You actually have
Mhm.
6 of them at different parts when you're
Yeah,
unpacking the attachment theory.
yeah,
So some new
yeah.
things I learned. I underlined a lot of that part of the book. But as you're walking through kind of some of that, it's a reminder that whatever generation we're living in, I know, like as you're mentioning, like Hildegard of Bingen and all these women, they were living at a time where Dr. Beth Allison Barr writes about in her Making a Biblical
Mhm.
Womanhood book, women's bodies in the Middle Ages were considered deformed, like they were
Yeah,
inherently
yeah.
bad. And then in our, generation, it's more like women's bodies are just sexy and that's it, like there's
Mhm.
nothing else. And so you have all kinds of issues on either one of those. But to
Yeah,
think that we are made in God's image out of love,
yeah,
we are loved.
yeah.
I think going back and learning from some of the early church fathers and mothers, but also
Mhm.
processing it now with the way our narratives are in our own church context is really important. How do you see those kind of coming together?
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend named Sam Jolman who just wrote a book called The Sex Talk You Never Got. And he's
Mm,
done a really good job with this. Sam and I graduated from the same clinical counseling program where we were required at a very early age. I went through when I was 27 years old to deal with our hearts. And can I tell a quick story about this? I
of
mean, just to
course,
make it
yeah.
practical. I'm in a counseling session. I'm doing a counseling session with a woman who's probably 23, 24. I'm 27. We're in the clinic. You've got that mirror window kind of deal going on, right? Where my female supervisor, Lottie, and several other women from our program are watching. And when I'm done with the counseling session, I walk out, and Lottie meets me, and she says, "It's time for your debrief." And so I walk into the room, and they ask me, "Well, how do you think the session went?" And I said, "I think it went great. I think I built trust. I think it was just awesome." And they're all sitting around. They look at one another and they say, "If you call flirting with a woman for an hour a good session," and they proceeded to do a lot of deconstruction work in my own life, in my own heart. Right? There's a lot more to that story that I can tell, but what the sum of it is, the woman wasn't blamed. I was asked to do work on my own heart, right? And so
Mm,
what's going on inside of you? How is that connected to your own your own stuff, Chuck. Well, it turns out that within me during that time, as I was flirting, well, that was anxious energy connected to my own story, connected in part to my relationship with my mom, among other things, some of the abuse
Yeah.
that I experienced. But I was a little boy anxiously trying to make conversation with a woman and unaware of what was going on within me in that moment.
Mm.
So they required me to grow up, is what I'm
That's
saying.
awesome.
To see this is, I think, the beautiful thing about this is is what led me to be able to do the work that I began doing several
Yeah.
years later with women, and why I think women began to experience me as safe, because I'd started to do this work within me that allowed them to feel like when I'm with Chuck, I don't feel like there's some sort of weird dynamic here,
Right.
but I feel like he really sees me. And that felt like an important part of the work over the years. But oftentimes it takes men doing that deeper work. And I just think so few of us do it. It's so much easier to sort of blame the woman who is immodest and isn't dressed appropriately or whatever the case may be, right?
Yeah. Or is breathing, basically.
It's breathing. It just showed
She's
up.
just there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
in the room.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, man, that's such a beautiful story. And it's so encouraging because I don't know. I mean, I don't know a story like that, like what you just told. And
yeah,
my experience is either men know how to treat women or they don't. But the ones who don't tend to not do the work. And it's a
yeah,
barrier for them and their, ministry. It's a barrier for how they're going to help women because that's half the
yeah,
church at least.
yeah,
And then I think both in just regular workplace and in the church, a lot of the targets of bullying are women and for a
yeah,
variety of reasons, but because of the way our social hierarchy works and
yeah,
expectations of workplace, whether it's ministry or not. And so that's why that work is so important. Women are dealing with enough as it is, and to have that extra layer of having to be hyper vigilant about
mhm,
what they wear or how they look or how they breathe or how they speak or whatever. It's up to men to do that work so that women can
yeah,
feel safe in churches and in workplaces. So thank you for this book, Healing What's
yeah.
Within. I really hope you get a lot of pre-orders. Everybody go pre-order this now. We're going to put a link in the show notes. I'm going to have you answer another question for our Difference Maker community on Patreon as an exclusive, but I just want to give you one last chance to say anything that you want our listeners to hear on the regular podcast.
I'm just grateful to be with you. I feel like we were talking beforehand that I wish I lived in the Bay Area still and hang out with you and Jason. I feel like we're kindred spirits, and I was reflecting yesterday on some of the work that I do and the work that you do and those of us do in these various spaces, and I think we complement one another in this work that we're doing. We need people. I do some of the therapeutic work, inquiries here and there, but we need people in a variety of different spaces nowadays speaking to these things and bringing light to darkness, right? And so, thank you for the voice that you have in the podcast and all that you do, Lori.
Chuck, I appreciate you so much. Everybody, if you haven't listened to the previous episode with him, go listen to that now. We'll also link that one because that book is incredible. And both of these books are so helpful to many of us who are trying to make a difference in this space. Thank you so much for your time. And how can people find you? Make sure you let them know.
Yeah, chuckdegroat.net is the website. Social media, X and the other. I'm not on TikTok. I'm 54 now. I can't do TikTok, but I'm on most of the social media spaces.
I hate TikTok. Oddly enough, it was banned when I was in China. I thought that was the one social media that would be there, but they only have the Chinese version available, which
Oh,
was like, of course. Yeah. Anyway, everybody go find Chuck on his website and follow his writing and his work. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for being on today, Chuck.
Thanks.
Before we go, I just want to take a moment to thank you. Yes, you. The fact that you're here, tuning in, leaning into these conversations, and doing the hard and beautiful work of making a difference in this world, it means everything to me. In this episode, if it spoke to you, if it brought you healing, hope, or even just a new perspective, I'd love for you to help us spread the word. Subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review, and share this episode with someone you think might need to hear it. Your support helps this community grow and also helps us to keep having these important conversations. You are such a vital part of this journey. And every time you listen, every time you share, you remind me of why we do this, because you are out there making a difference in your own beautiful, messy, and imperfect way. And that matters more than you know. So thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for making the world a little brighter, a little kinder, and a little more whole. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep making a difference. You are loved.